Boy, do I have a doozy of a story for you today about the SBC. No story that I've heard up until this point has done a better job at absolutely destroying whatever credibility and trust the Southern Baptist Convention has left. Now, I love the SBC. I have attended multiple SBC churches myself in the past, and I want to see them change. I want to see them improve. I want them to eradicate all of this corruption. But in order to do that, we need to expose the corruption, and we need to expose the people trying to hide the corruption. This story is huge. This is the story that when people ask you what's going on in the SBC, you can point them to this story to give the absolute worst, horrible example of the absolute corruption in the highest levels of the Southern Baptist Convention and people who are trying to intentionally suppress it. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Spare No Arrows. My name is Cody Lawrence. Before I get into the story, again, I wanted to reiterate, I care about the SBC. I know I have many friends who go to SBC churches. I have attended SBC churches in the past myself. And I'm sad to see this stuff. And I have seen many people in the SBC, pastors and church members alike, being swept up in the myth that everything's fine in the SBC when it really isn't. And there is blatant and obvious, horrible corruption in the SBC that needs to be dealt with. And if it's not, then the SBC is going to just continue going in exactly the direction that it's been going in, which is straight to hell. So here's the story. I got this from SBC Underground, which is a very good Twitter page at SBC Underground. That deals a lot with exposing things that are going on behind the scenes in the SBC and, just things that are obvious that we should be aware of. Like he recently shared that Russell Moore is doing a talk on the Enneagram and the gospel. And that's interesting because, we know the Enneagram is terrible. And I have a video on that. So go watch that if you want more information on the Enneagram. But regardless, this story is about a man named Bruce Ashford. And so I'm basically just going to read the tweets to you. Also, John Harris from Conversations That Matter also did a really good podcast on this. I'll provide all of the links for the sources in the description of this podcast. So here we go. SBC Underground says, "Did you see the horror story about Bruce Ashford, former Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary provost, rising SBC star, and platform made man? Appear a few days ago, get some attention, then go completely quiet. Why the sudden silence? Because the story exposes the highest profile Southern Baptists. You may need a reminder on who Ashford is due to his rise to stardom being suddenly aborted. Again, he was an SEBTS man, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, aiming his attention outside provost duties at Christian approaches to culture and politics, like many of them do. And so here's his book, Letters to an American Christian by Bruce Riley Ashford, which you may have heard of. Pretty popular book. There was real talk at one time that he would replace Russell Moore at the ERLC. Then one day he was just gone. Seriously, just gone. The disappearance was jarring and complete. The vacuum filled with hushed whispers of dark rumors, but outside elite circles, the reason for Ashford's disappearance was unknown. That vacuum started being filled only now, years later, earlier this week. And as soon as the information began circulating, all discussion was hushed in the strictest possible terms. It started with this piece from @ThouArtTheMan from @WartWatch. The details are something out of a true crime film, and you should absolutely go check out the original article. Again, I will have it linked in the comment section of the video. To recount, let's begin back when Bruce disappeared from his position. Make no bones about it, Lauren, so Bruce had a wife named Lauren. Lauren's wife is clear in her accusation that Bruce abused her. So what happened was the SBC in recent history has been pushing all this like hashtag #MeToo stuff, and the SBC hired Guidepost and LGBT alphabet people affirming group to teach them about how to deal with sexual situations and to audit their responses to investigate them and audit their responses to certain sexual abuse cases that have been happening in the SBC. So they've been really pushing this stuff hard. But it seems like, just as kind of a side note, they're being kind of picky with the sexual abuse situations that are coming out. Because here is one that has been kept totally silent. And the theory is it was kept silent because Bruce Ashford was such a large name in the SBC. Oh, and by the way, I said earlier that there was talk of him replacing Russell Moore at the ERLC. The ERLC is the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission, which Russell Moore used to be the head of before he left to go be the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And Russell Moore is also the one who is going to be doing the Enneagram talk that he's advertising recently. So a lot of interesting connections here. But continuing, so Lauren Ashford accused her husband of abuse, and it seems like nothing was done. She is clear in her accusation that Bruce abused her, and in fact, one of the rumors flying around when Bruce's disappearance was noted was that Lauren had posted on Facebook about a particularly nasty fall off a ladder. And if we look at the tweet, it says, "This is what he says, but behind closed doors, it is very different." So she's sharing one of her husband's posts. She says, "God spared me. He is now taking me out of this hell. Bruce is divorcing me." Interesting. So I don't know all the details about their relationship or their divorce, and I don't care to. But if what she's saying is true here, then Bruce is the one divorcing her, which I think is interesting, and not her divorcing him. Anyway, regardless, as mentioned above, Lauren claims Bruce abused her, and for his part, Bruce has been quite open about a time in rehab where he worked through his demons. While no one has any interest in connecting those dots, they nonetheless suggest a common narrative. And so here is Bruce Ashford's personal update, where he explains that, and you can pause the video and read it on the screen if you're watching this, if you're not listening. And then here's the continuation of his post with pictures. Moving on. And it is here that the exposure of SBC elites, along with self-identified abuse advocates, really begins. Let's start with Lauren's own social media posts. She appealed directly to @R_Denhollander, at Beth Moore, LPM, and her pastor, @JD Greear. Now, JD Greear, if you are familiar with him, was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention 2 presidents ago. Currently, we have Bart Barber, and his name will come up later. Previous to him, we had the chronic plagiarist and liar Ed Litton. Previous to him, we had JD Greear, who also potentially was a plagiarist himself and was involved with something called the Docent Research Group, who wrote sermons for pastors, which is a pretty bad deal. And there's other videos and topics on that about why that's a big deal if you're curious. But it's a problem for pastors to not write their own sermons. It sums up the story. So let's start with Lauren's social media posts. She appealed directly to these big name people: Denhollander, Beth Moore. Beth Moore's huge. Rachel, I believe her name is Rachel Denhollander. She's a big high up member in the SBC who was, I think, heading some kind of task force or like heading a sexual abuse communication line to where like you can reach out to her directly and she will help give you resources, something like that. So all these people are big, huge, high up members in the SBC with power, and they should have been able to do something about this. So she appealed directly to them. Nothing came of it. Why? Why did the biggest names in the SBC ignore a woman's clear and repeated pleas for help with her abusive husband? The answer is found at her church, Summit, at Summit RDU, pastored by JD Greear, who was a longtime friend of Bruce Ashford's. Interesting. The plot thickens. And also where Bruce Ashford served as elder. So he was a good buddy with JD Greear. Bruce Ashford and JD Greear, they were buddies. And Bruce Ashford was even also a member of the church and served as elder, which, if we remember, eldership has certain qualifications, and it seems like someone in this kind of position wouldn't be qualified to be an elder. And maybe the church dealt with that appropriately, but just something to keep in mind. And then here are some articles or some pieces of text that explain more about that. Bruce Ashford himself says, JD is a longtime friend and was my college roommate. Very interesting. Very interesting. SBC Underground says, you read that right. Lauren had to appeal for help with her abusive husband to a man who was his college roommate and who served with him on their church's elder board. With JD Greear, one of the previous presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention. Remember Brian Lourdes. Now, this is something else. According to Julie Royce, Lourdes destroyed evidence of abuse that happened at his church. This is going to tie in just a moment. His church in Memphis, so he destroyed evidence of abuse that happened at his church in Memphis, then rehired the abuser. Summit investigated itself. This is the same church. This is J.D. Greear's church. Summit investigated itself and found, shocking, it had done nothing wrong in hiring Lourdes. So this article says that eyewitnesses say Brian Lourdes covered up sex crimes. Pretty bad deal, right? Pretty rough. Greer's friend, Rachel Denhollander, managed a single, quote, I'm discouraged reaction to this sham of a cover-up. Contrast that with the normal energy of her condemnation of abuse, let alone cover-up. So here's what her tweet says in response to this situation from Rachel Denhollander. I am deeply discouraged by this hire as things stand right now. From Summit's statement, it would appear that the process for bringing Brian on board is more extensive than many churches would have done. Now, compare that to, you can go look at her Twitter profile yourself and see how fired up she gets about other things. When this is a pretty bad deal. This is something to get pretty fired up about, right? So for some reason, she's like a little less fired up about this, and also she doesn't respond to Bruce's wife's pleas for help from her abusive husband. Okay, now that we see that she herself ignored a plea for help coming from a member of JD's church, coming from the wife of an elder at Summit, coming from the wife of a man who served as an SEBTS provost, coming from a man with insider status within the SBC platform. Platform membership comes with a certain kind of privilege, it appears. Interesting. In fact, based on Lourdes and Ashford's stories, it appears the safest place for an abuser is under J.D. Greear's wings within the safety of Summit Church. And since Denhollander is mentioned, let's ask another question. Remember the SBC report from Guidepost, here it is, on abuse that she is so closely related with? While the only new account the report surfaced was Johnny Hunt's gross whatever, the report conspicuously did not find Ashford's abuse of his wife, despite Miss Ashford's appealing directly to Denhollander. How could that be? The answer appears obvious. Friendship covers a multitude of sins in the SBC's elite circles. And lest we think Denhollander is the only high-profile abuse advocate that ignored Lauren, we should consider how a whistleblower tried to reach Julie Royce and was similarly ignored. Not all abuse accounts are created equal, it appears. Interesting. So let me back up. Again, Rachel Denhollander was some leading member having to do with the Guidepost report. And in the Guidepost report, they actually included supposed alleged incidences of sexual abuse. Again, Guidepost was hired by the SBC. Guidepost is also Alphabet People Affirming, which directly contradicts not only the Bible, but the statement of faith of the SBC, but they hire them anyway. And Rachel Denhollander is some big shot that helps to be in charge of this. And on the Guidepost report, there were instances of sexual abuse, alleged sexual abuse, that was named that actually had no evidence. They were just accusations. So why wasn't this accusation also listed? And you could say, well, because there wasn't any evidence for it. But there was no evidence of many of the cases that were evidently in the Guidepost report. Something to think about. Before we move on, remember that Bruce Ashford was the provost at SEBTS again, so he's a big shot. So now we have two provosts for SEBTS involved in alleged appalling immorality. Ashford's alleged abuse of his wife and Keith Whitfield's attempt to destroy Tom Buck with his wife's unpublished manuscript. Now, this is a situation where Tom Buck, you can find him on Twitter too. Tom Buck seems to be a faithful guy, good dude, conservative Southern Baptist, and his wife wrote some article that she never actually published regarding like difficulties in their marriage. I don't exactly remember all the details because this happened a while back, but somebody got a hold of that document that she didn't want published. She shared it with somebody to look it over, but in the end, she decided not to publish it. And it wasn't, the point of it, I don't think, was to make her husband look bad. The point of it was just to say, look at all the stuff we've been through, I think. But you can do more research on your own. And someone leaked it in order to make Tom Buck look bad, essentially. So horrible, horrible situation. Evidently, Keith Whitfield was responsible for this. His wife's unpublished manuscript, an affair that included Whitfield lying to Danny Aiken, who is the president of, is he the president of Southern or Southeastern? He's the president of one of the seminaries. I want to say it's Southeastern, just because all this is wrapped up in Southeastern. So Whitfield lied to Danny Aiken for a time about his involvement in the attempted character assassination of Tom Buck over political differences. It actually gets worse, if you can believe it. Ashford was quietly, very, very quietly, removed from the SBC Resolutions Committee in January of 2021. Why? Can anyone propose an answer other than because they knew? And look at who all is involved. James Merritt, JD Greear, again, current SBC president Bart Barber, and presumptive SBC Executive Committee President appointment Jared Wellman. So a lot of big shot elites in the SBC seem to be involved in the removal of Bruce Ashford. And we're not really given a reason why. And the assumed answer is because they knew what this stuff was that he did and they didn't want to share it publicly, which seems to be a problem. It's pretty unbiblical. Public repentance for public sin is a biblical thing. Let's continue. They didn't ask why Bruce was no longer on the committee? Please, that's not how the platform operates. So here we have breaking down this article of some of the maybe inconsistencies that are happening in this story here. So there you have it. The SBC wants to be caring well about abuse victims, except apparently those who become victims through the platforms made men. That goes for the current president, Barber. The presumptive new president of the executive committee, Wellman. Former president, Greear, pastor of Summit Church who appears to believe God whispers about his friends being involved in abuse and abuse cover-up. Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary at the highest levels. Rachel Denhollander, Guidepost, and the Abuse Task Force, Beth Moore, and even Julie Royce. He referenced there something that JD Greear said in a sermon, which he has since, many years later, taken back a little bit, I think, where he said, God whispers about sexual sin in the Bible, but he shouts about other kind of sins. And so therefore, we should not focus too much on sexual sins, but we should focus on other things. That's what JD Greear, the outrageous nonsense that JD Greear preached in his sermon. And so he's referencing that. Maybe JD Greear thinks that God whispers about sexual abuse. So Lauren Ashford, Bruce Ashford's wife, who was abused, evidently, her abuse doesn't count. It's an even more directly dangerous and destructive version of what the same group did and ignored being done to Jennifer Buck. So they're essentially gaslighting everybody around them to make somebody look bad or discreditable, to make themselves look good. Believe all the people named above care at all about abuse if you want. So what he's saying is, you can believe that all these, the Bart Barber, JD Greear, the Summit Church, whatever, believe all these people care about abuse if you want. The actual case narratives indicate that they only care about maintaining power, keeping the benefits of leadership, punishing their enemies, and protecting their friends. Remember, Lauren Ashford, the next time they try to sell you a different story. So if they tell you they care about abuse, they want to, not that silence people, hashtag Me Too, whatever. Remember this. Remember Jennifer Buck. Remember this blatant and obvious corruption and ignoring a poor woman who just unfortunately happened to be married to a big shot in the SBC. But let's continue. As for Bruce, new allegations levied against him after his friends in the platform ignored his behavior. They're shocking and will prove horrifying if true. So Bruce has continued to have these horrible allegations against him. Now, first consider this. If there is some kind of conservative person, how quick is the SBC and the Gospel Coalition and 9 Marks, how quick are they to distance themselves from these people? Think a Doug Wilson type. How quick are they to totally dissociate themselves with people who they are comfortable with not liking because it's trendy? Now consider this guy, Bruce Ashford, and how slow all these people are to distance themselves from him. And think about the kind of people who they're okay with distancing themselves from, and think about the kind of people who they should be distancing themselves from, and they're not. Evangelism, or evangelicalism, SBC Underground says, still loves him. His name is still everywhere. At Southern Baptist Convention, the Gospel Coalition, who he's written articles for, and 9 Marks. This thread really only scratches the surface of this debacle and the rank hypocrisy of the SBC's elite, along with some of the highest profile evangelicals. Think Robert Downen is going to report this to the Houston Chronicle when his sources are implicated. To give credit, Wartburg Watch has been all over this from very early on. You should read their reporting, all of which can be found from this cumulative article. John Harris, like I said earlier, has also been in this debate explaining some things going on. Then something else happened. 3 months ago, it was discovered that Bruce Ashford, the former provost of Southern Baptist Evangelical Seminary, or Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, was accused of attempting to drug a young black female 15 minutes from the Southern Baptist Seminary. Ashford was working for Lyft at the time, and 17-year-old Ezia Bowden was his passenger. So I just want us to watch this video here for a moment.
First, for a terrifying experience for one Raleigh teenager on a ride home from work. The 17-year-old ended up in the ER here after jumping from a moving car. Isaiah Bowden making that desperate move after a Lyft driver's behavior made her suspicious. And we begin there on this Friday. I'm Amber Rapinta.
And I'm Joel Brown. Thanks for joining us. That teenager was on her way home from work when she says the Lyft driver sprayed something inside the car and she immediately started feeling weird.
Yeah, and it all happened so fast for Isaiah Bowden, who says that she blacked out after she opened the car door, only remembering where she landed and how she felt scared and was crying. Unfortunately, she's back at home recovering from her injuries from the fall, so no broken bones. And she says her suspicion first grew after she got in the Lyft and the driver made comments that made her uncomfortable, such as how she looks good and that he'd date her if she wasn't so young.
When I got in his car, it did smell like cigarettes. So when he sprayed one time, it was already like, oh, it no longer smells like that. But for you to keep spraying it, then roll your windows up, like, I know it's not about me being nervous or anything. I'm just like, I know how it made me feel. I was very scared, but then again, I was more so like, I'd rather get out of this car than, fall asleep in a car with this man, and I don't really know.
The Southern Baptist Convention for a very long time has been in the habit of hiding horrible things that Bruce Ashford was doing. And so perhaps JD Greear and other people who were close to Bruce Ashford was actually aware of what he was capable of, and they decided to cover it up anyway. And perhaps those actions led Bruce Ashford to also assaulting this poor girl. She jumped from the moving car and was subsequently rushed to the emergency room. Ashford lost his job with Lyft. No charges were filed. Here's why it's significant. So you can see the pictures here, the explanation of the story. And the reason we know it's Bruce Ashford is because he worked for Lyft, and there's his photo. His name was Bruce, she said, and that's his photo. That's Bruce Ashford, prior provost of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, author of the Gospel Coalition, one of the authors in the Gospel Coalition, member of Nine Marks, best buddies with JD Greear, or at least college roommates and good friend. Maybe not best buddies, but good friend. This is not the first time Ashford was accused of inappropriate behavior, and again, this guy mentions his wife, and it just goes on and reiterates a lot of the information that we already talked about. So here's the takeaways. Bruce Ashford's obviously a bad guy. There is absolutely corruption happening in the SBC. If you are a member of the SBC, I think you ought to bring this to the attention of your pastors. What are you going to do about this? We need to fight the actual sexual abuse that the SBC pretends to be fighting. But we need to actually fight it. And actually fighting it seemingly might mean fighting people like Bart Barber, like JD Greear, like Rachel Denhollander. So here's the question. Here's the question you can ask yourselves. If you ever have a chance to have a conversation with your pastor about this, the question you can ask yourself is, and I think most SBC churches are not like this. Now, I went to an SBC church previous to my current church that was so intricately bound tightly with the evangelical elitism in the SBC. And I know their answer to this question, but this is something that you could consider asking, maybe even just internally to yourself in your church. Do they care more about actual sexual abuse, or let's just say sin in general, stopping sin in general in their institutions, in their churches, in their organizations? Or do they care more about power? Do they care more about maintaining their own power? And do they care more about maintaining the power of their buddies in the seminaries, in the churches, in the governmental structure of the Southern Baptist Convention? Ask yourself that if you go to these seminaries, if you go to an SBC church, or if you're in any way involved with the Southern Baptist Convention, I can't see how anybody would want to stick around this unless they are actively fighting. If your church is a part of the SBC and you know this stuff's happening, I don't personally understand how you could be okay with staying in the SBC, but there potentially are reasons where you would want to stay, and the only reason I think that would be appropriate is because we're fighting. I don't know that you're going to do any good, but holy moly, the corruption is insane. It's insane. True crime stuff, like the SBC Underground said. So hopefully I gave you some things to think about. Do your own research, dive into this and all of the people I mentioned in this podcast yourself if you want to learn more, and you will find out a laundry list of horrible things that all of these people have continuously been involved in. Not just in regards to sexual abuse, but say opinions on things like abortion, potentially progressivism, twisting scripture in various different ways. And I could give many examples, and I've talked about them before on the podcast, of things like JD Greear, Ed Litton, Bart Barber, whatever. So something to think about. Hopefully this podcast was educational, and I will catch you next time. God bless.